Well, the first thing to say is I'm following an article about baldness. Are you trying to tell me something?
It did occur to me.
This is chemotherapy. This isn't baldness. Can you imagine having this as a haircut? You wouldn't pay for it, would you? So I'm in treatment. I'm in second-line treatment because I have got terminal stomach cancer. And the relevance of the interview is that the CDF has funded my second-line treatment, which is experimental. I'm receiving Taxotere, which is usually used for cancers such as breast cancer and cervical cancer. So that's my story, really. The only thing I would add is that I haven't at any point in my treatment had the thought of funding being relevant. So if it becomes relevant, that would simply be very scary, wouldn't it?
You have the most wonderful sense of humour, Steve. Just on funding, you say that it's not been relevant to you. Do you have any idea how much those drugs are costing?
I couldn't tell you, but it's expensive. It is thousands of pounds. That the clinical support that I get, the oncology clinical support that I get and have had since diagnosis in 2011, has been exemplary. My oncology professor is a man called Professor David Ferry, and people immediately told me I needed a second opinion, so my wife Googled who he was, and she found out that he was one of the world's leading authorities on keeping people alive with stomach cancer. And the first thing she said was, "What's he doing in Wolverhampton?" That's the first thing she said. So I'm blessed, really. I have the very best of care. And he's the only reason, together with my wife, is the only reason I'm alive. So it's, you know, you put your hands in people you trust, you put your life in people you trust, and they're not betraying that trust.
Yes, well, Steve, thank you very much for that. Jonathan, listening to Steve's story there, this is something that is keeping people alive. This is a fund that is keeping people alive. I mean, is there any excuse? Could there possibly be a reason why that shouldn't happen?
Well, the government's put £200 million a year into the Cancer Drugs Fund, so it is treating these cancer drugs slightly differently to other treatments in the NHS. It's not entirely clear that these drugs are making that sort of difference, that they keep patients alive. There's an assumption that a drug, because it's licensed, works, but in fact there's a huge variation. Some drugs work really well, and if that's the case, there's no problem with the NHS funding them, and some of them don't work very well. And, you know, and I think the ones in the Cancer Drugs Fund tend to be the ones that we're not sure they work that well, and they're often quite expensive. So,
but I just wonder, I mean, you're not the bad guy in this equation, but if you, in the report we heard from Lisa, who's a mother who is dying, who's trying to extend her life. We're talking to Steve this morning. I mean, how do you explain to people like that who think that those drugs that is exactly what they are doing, keeping them alive for a little bit longer? How do you explain to them this is something that is possibly going to go? It's not clear yet what will happen next year.
No, I agree. It's not clear. I think if the government's put this money in already, it's difficult to imagine that it won't somehow be in the system next year. But in terms of the drugs themselves, it's all about the evidence. If the evidence is good that they work, then we're going to want to use them because they will keep patients alive. But if it's not clear, then we've got to take another look at this. And it is balancing the individual patient's needs against what the NHS can do for wider patients.
Steve, you were trying to come in there, sorry.
Yes, there was not a problem. I was only coming in relevant to the fact that I was listening to what was being said. My treatment, and apologies for interrupting there, my treatment is having an effect. But I do agree with the gentleman that was just calling that there has to be clinical assessment. And having the quality of clinicians that I've got means that is what's happening in support of my treatment. So there is the peer review of the trials that have taken place on Taxotere, mainly outside of this country, and that it is on that evidence, I believe, that the CDF have agreed to fund this treatment.
Steve, you have to be one of the most optimistic guests we have ever spoken to, which is lovely. But to hear that this funding for these drugs, which you are very important to you, to hear that may be taken away, how does that make you feel?
Scared. I just don't look it.
Oh, Steve, you honestly, you go down as one of my favourite guests ever, and that's the bottom line, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
How long have you been doing this?
Not a lot, a very long
A bloke from
time.
Wolverhampton is one of your favourite guests. Marvellous.
But on that point, I mean, Steve, I mean, he's joking all the way through, but I mean, he's not joking when he said this makes him scared. And if the effect of this being talked about, discussed in this way, is that, then that's bad in itself, isn't it? To put people in that situation.
In terms of individual patients, I mean, there's always been a principle in the NHS that once a patient started on a treatment, they will finish that course, even if the sort of rules about the funding change for other patients. So, yeah, in terms of Steve, he will carry on and finish the course of treatment as he needs to. As I say, it is difficult to know what's going to happen in a year's time, but the cancer drugs are treated differently. They are seen as a special case. The public clearly cares about them. It's always in the media. And I think the government will probably somehow keep that money in the system. It might not be as a cancer drugs fund.
Indeed, the Department of Health statement does say they will make sure arrangements are in place from 2014 to protect individual patients receiving treatment. Does that give you much comfort, Steve?
They're big. They are big issues to talk about, aren't they? Really. At a time where there's been so many cutbacks being made, one is always conscious that when someone takes funding and changes it at a great cost, what is the reason for changing it? Is it to spend the same amount of money? Normally it's to rationalise and make more effective. Those are the government words that one hears a lot. And to give the funding to the people that can make those decisions more effectively. Well, if that's the case, give all the money to my professor and he'll do the job fine.
Yeah, just on a last thought, Steve, I mean, right now, how are you? I mean, how are you sort of keeping?
Well, I'm in the middle of a Taxotere treatment cycle of 3 treatments of 21 days. The first treatment brought on something called neutropenic sepsis, which is a type of blood poisoning. But they caught it with 48 hours before it became life-threatening. And as my consultant says, with your journey, mate, that's forward planning. So, you know, I'm in good hands.
Oh, Steve.
And as soon as he said the word mendable, I switched off, really. I didn't care. So, yes, I'm all right, but it's awful. It is awful. But it's there for a reason, and I feel very hopeful. Whilst I've got chemotherapy inside me, I know the tumour is no longer active. My blood is very good, so I'm very positive. You see, what it's going to do, it's going to enable me to see the summer. And when you have a life-limited condition, it is very much on the focus. And we're not thinking about Christmas. But it doesn't matter, because I was given 12 months to live 18 months ago. So it is all relevant. And all of our time, really, is spent concentrating on our friends and our family, because I tell you this, it is them that suffer. Me, it's a different thing. But being detached but still close to cancer is appalling, as anyone who's got it in their family will tell you. And it is those people who suffer as much as the people with cancer.
Steve Evans, as I say, one of my all-time favourite guests. Thank you very much for talking to us on Breakfast this morning.